do really today is to present as succinctly as possible really the main arguments and findings of a paper which I've just had published in the European Journal of Political Research. And it is based on an analysis of survey data, yet another YouGov survey, which we were able to gather 2 years ago now, and which has a kind of specifically designed module of questions which are pertinent to what we were interested in. And in essence, the paper really investigates this one, I think quite simply stated, key hypothesis that there are essentially two different kinds of critic of the political system out there, at least two different kinds of low-trust citizen, if you like. And they are people that I refer to in the paper as dissatisfied Democrats and stealth Democrats. And you may recognise straight away that these are not original terms. You may well recognise them from the literature. Indeed, I'm going to explain that in a moment or two. But I find them quite useful forms of shorthand, really, to try and encapsulate these different types of political citizen that are out there. The point is that they both take a rather dim view of the way politics is conducted at the moment, and the political elites in particular. And in particular, they have rather different attitudes, I would say, towards political participation. And that's important, I think, ultimately, because when we engage in debates about, well, what is to be done, should we have, as is often suggested, more radical forms of participatory involvement for people, then I think the answer depends partly on which kind of citizen that you are trying to address and their problems. Because I think greater participatory involvement is fine for the first group, the dissatisfied Democrats. I'm not so sure that it wouldn't actually be counterproductive in respect of the latter group that I'm calling stealth Democrats. So, anyway, we start with the problem of democratic disconnect and disaffection and so on and so forth. That's just a brief list of the kinds of evidence which is often referred to when we do this. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail. Much of it's been referred to implicitly or in passing this morning anyway, but you know the kinds of things that we're talking about. The problems of the low esteem in which parties and politicians are held very often, not just in this country, but across much of the democratic world, and the kind of knock-on effects that's had in terms of party system change, electoral volatility, the rise of anti-system parties and so on. Systematic reductions in electoral turnout over time, and of course partisan de-alignment and the decline of party membership. And there is of course a literature which engages with this and tries to not only measure it but also to explain why it's happened. I'm just going to focus very briefly on referring to one item I plucked out of that literature, which I quite like and find persuasive, at least as a comparative rather than a sort of national-centric explanation thing. But also because it provides a useful cue for one of these two ideal types of disaffected citizen that I'm going to refer to today. Russ Dalton came out with a book nearly a decade ago now, which some of you may well know, called Democratic Challenges, Democratic Choices. And he said that when you look at the problem in comparative terms across the democratic world, that there really seem to be two major underlying long-term problems which have given rise to this growing lack of trust and disaffection. The first is the rising expectations of government on the part of ordinary citizens. And in particular, this is something which characterises the younger, better educated, better affluent type of citizen. In many ways, the people who actually have benefited most, as it were, by the spread of democracy. But these people are not anti-democrats, they are people who are driven by a passion for the democratic creed, as Dalton puts it in his book. And they are disillusioned with what they regard as the frustrations of the rather staid and restrictive form of democratic practice which they experience. The second kind of problem which interacts with this is the increasingly complex nature of issue agendas, which I think is a significant problem, but it's not something which I'm going to refer to today because it's not directly pertinent to this paper, but for the sake of not travestying Dalton, I just want to refer to it at least. So in terms of these dissatisfied Democrats, these people who have a passion for democratic involvement, then if you think about the kind of what is to be done literature and the arguments which are put forward on behalf of democratic involvement, then you can see very clearly these are the sorts of people, precisely the sorts of people who would be most likely to be enticed by that kind of a remedy, as it were. And indeed, the claims on behalf of greater participatory reform and so on are not made just by political scientists, political theorists, but also clearly governments and even the European Union, local governments and so on, have been taking these ideas seriously. Sometimes enacting them, sometimes not, as John said earlier this morning, but we have seen various reforms, and it clearly is something that actual decision makers are really interested in. However, there are skeptics who don't believe that this is the answer, and there are, I think, very broadly, two kinds of skeptical response. The first one is that really the problem of democratic disconnect or disaffection flows in large part really from the failure of most ordinary citizens to understand the nature of politics as it really is. And there are a number of kind of names there that I referred to. Meg Russell made this argument very forcefully in a Fabian Society pamphlet that came out a few years ago. I hope I'm not travestying Jerry by putting his name in there as well, because I know that, you know, from some of his work, he's not against the idea of participation reform as well. But as I understand your arguments, also there is this sense that there is an issue with many citizens not really understanding what the nature of politics and the decision-making process is. Hansard, various Hansard Society publications, I think, have kind of been in that vein as well. And then, secondly, if the problem is not really so much directly one of lack of participatory involvement, then it follows more or less logically that the solution is not more participation. And there is a long tradition, of course, of people writing rather sceptically about the democratic potential of ordinary citizens to be involved, going right back to Weber and Schumpeter. But I think in recent years, the most, you might say strident, but certainly striking contribution to this literature actually comes from an American book, which some of you may well know, which is by John Hibbing and Elizabeth Tyson Morse, a book that came out just over 10 years ago called Stealth Democracy, which is a study of American citizens. And they make a very strong case that trying to foist more participation on people is not the way to solve the problem. And there's this quote, which I always like giving at this point in these kind of talks, where I say, which comes from their book, and they say, the last thing that people want is to be more involved in political decision-making. They do not want to make political decisions themselves. They do not want to provide much input to those who are assigned to make these decisions, and they would rather not know the details of the decision-making process. This doesn't mean that people think no mechanism for government accountability is necessary. They just don't want the mechanism to come into play except under unusual circumstances. And they summarise this kind of orientation towards politics as being a preference for what they call stealth democracy. That is, people need to know that democratic accountability is there. It's a thing which they can use in order to call to account and hold in check the political elites. But they want it to be kind of under the radar most of the time. They really not get, rather than have to get too involved on a day-to-day basis with political involvement. That actually is something which Hibbing and Tyson will say in many ways is a rather naive kind of attitude, but it's the kind of attitude which is very widespread, nevertheless. So, through that very brief discussion of parts of the literature, you can probably see, I hope you can see anyway, where this main hypothesis is derived from. But I think that there are probably then broadly at least two kinds of disaffected citizen out there. People using the terminology which Dalton uses, we can call dissatisfied Democrats, and through a wider reading of the literature, I would expect these people to be middle or upper class, relatively well educated, interested in politics, a strong sense of political efficacy and a sense of their own capacity to get involved and make things happen, articulate devotees of the idea of becoming involved, of being engaged citizens. And on the other hand, you've got the stealth Democrats, and they are much more likely to be of lower socioeconomic status, less well educated, inactive, not at all interested in politics, largely absorbed by their own private concerns, and they would not be oriented towards the idea of greater political involvement. Okay. So that is where, you know, I derived this main hypothesis, which is what I'm really engaged with in this paper. One of the implications of this, though, if that is true, is that if you try to foist, as it were, more democratic involvement on society as a whole, then it is possible that actually you really only benefit the first of those two groups, the dissatisfied Democrats, the people who really want to go in that direction anyway, at the risk of further marginalising and alienating the second group, the stealth Democrats, the people who maybe needed to rely traditionally on representatives, interlocutors, as their tribunes, but would now find, in a sense, their voice even more drowned out by these noisy, participative, educated, self-confident lot, if you like. Okay, so what do I do then in the paper empirically to actually see how far this is true in the case of Britain? Well, what I've done with our data is to try to get measures of stealth democratic orientation and dissatisfied democratic orientation. I'm not going to go into the details of exactly how I've done that, but there are some of the details there. The first thing, basically I've created additive indices for these things from attitudinal questions in the surveys. For stealth democracy, I've taken the original indicators, there were 4 indicators that Hibbing and Tice-Morse themselves developed in the American case. I've actually gone beyond it. I've created my own index, which takes into account another dimension, really, which I think is very closely connected, which is the dimension of conflict avoidance. Because, and this is actually something, again, which comes out of a close reading of Hibbing and Tice-Morse, because they more or less say this themselves, even though they don't construct their measure this way, that people who are stealth Democrats are also typically conflict avoidant. One of the things they hate about politics is the sheer noise and bluster and adversarialism of it. They can't understand why politicians need to make an argument and dispute at everything, because they kind of assume almost in a Rousseauian way that there is a common general will out there, there is a common public interest, which people of goodwill and often of technocratic expertise ought to be able to see straight away. There's one kind of simple, logical, in the common interest solution to every public policy view. That's one of the things that actually says quite naive, but it's the kind of mindset that people come to this with. So for me, stealth democracy it has to have an element of being conflict avoidant as well. So I've created this scale. If you look at the descriptives on the scale, actually it suggests that as a whole, our sample is not particularly stealth democratic in this sense. We have a measure also of dissatisfied democracy, which is based again on some American research, a separate piece of research by David Nedlow and others, which they call their Sunshine Democracy Index. It's a little bit, in terms of democracy, it's a little bit like being in favour of motherhood and apple pie, I suppose, because these are kind of positive statements really about democracy, democratic values. But the key thing is that we're getting a measure of how positively people are oriented towards democracy, but they are also people who express a low trust in political elites. Because one thing I do with all the empirical analysis is just select out the people who explicitly declare themselves having low trust in political elites. Okay. If you look at this scale, interestingly, the scale mean and distribution suggests that on the whole, the British sample is actually it ranks quite highly on the dissatisfied democracy index. And in fact, with some other stuff that I do, my conclusion in terms of chopping the data a bit is that on the whole, our British sample is more dissatisfied democratic than it is stealth democratic, if I can put it in those ways. And I put some figures on that in the paper. There are 2 basic major things that I try to do with these measures when I've got them. The first one is to check, in order to test this hypothesis, the first thing that I do is try and check what the ideological and demographic background of people who score highly on these 2 indices actually is like. And the hypothesis, of course, is that people who score highly on stealth democracy ought to be lower socioeconomic status, less well educated, and so on and so forth. And people who score higher on dissatisfied democracy should be the converse of those things. And I do this by doing an ordinary least squares analysis, regression analysis, and the basic findings are there, as you can see. But first of all, people's scores on these two indices actually are significantly negatively and inversely related to one another, which is good in terms of the hypothesis, at least. That was what I was expecting to find. And then the upshot of this really is that the people who score highly on the stealth democracy index are indeed generally people who have significantly lower educational attainment and background, lower interest in politics, a lower sense of political efficacy. They tend to be younger, female, which incidentally I attribute mainly to females being more conflict avoidant, as it were, in terms of these responses than males. They tend to be lower socioeconomic status, and also to be social authoritarians or conservatives as well. By contrast, the people who score highly on the dissatisfied democracy index are almost exactly the converse of all of those things. They tend to be older, better educated, politically interested, have a sense of political efficacy, and they tend to be left of centre as well. And all of that is consistent with the expectations set out in the hypothesis. But the second part of testing the hypothesis is their attitudes towards political participation. We know that this is the kind of background of these people, so what do they actually think when it comes to getting involved in politics? The way that I've operationalised this is to ask a series of hypothetical questions about hypothetical willingness to become involved in politics, to participate in various ways. And there are 4 different forms of participation that specifically I've tried to measure, and in slightly different ways. I've tried to look at people's attitudes to deliberative democracy, to referendum democracy, and to what I call party electoral participation and non-party participation. And briefly, those are the details of how we go about constructing these kind of measures. So with respect to deliberative democracy, which I am separating out from political participation generally, or referendum direct democracy, because it's a specific form of kind of sitting down and rationalising, getting into a debate with something, almost as if you're in a focus group or an academic seminar, I suppose. We ask a specific question about whether people would be willing to become involved in face-to-face discussions, or indeed online. We slightly varied the questions, actually, for parts of the sample. Deliberations and discussions about political affairs with their elected representatives. Referendum democracy question was a question about how far they approved of referendums in general. Political participation, the party and non-party participation scores are additive indices, asking people how willing they would be to do various kinds of things related to party or interest group or other forms of political activity. And the upshot of this is, again, more or less, in fact, it's pretty well exactly as I had hypothesized. The higher that people score on the stealth democracy index, the less they are willing to deliberate or participate in party electoral or non-party forms of mainstream activity. But there is quite an interesting caveat about this, which is that I hypothesized that the situation would be different with regard to referendum democracy.